Hey, you want to give me a hand? Thanks. Here, use this. That should work perfectly. Oh, hey mates, I'm just getting in the spirit of today's adventure by making my own Frankenstein's monster. Because today, we're going to be talking about Frankenstein movies. A perfect way to start off our Spooktacular October. Did someone say spooktacular? Hey, little creep. Greetings. What on earth are you up to? We're making a Frankenstein's monster, because today we're going to be talking about Frankenstein movies. Wait, aren't you still under investigation from the last time? Well, hopefully it works out. So, flip the switch. Say, I didn't think he was going to be that tall. Well, they always look smaller lying down. Maybe he's friendly. Hey, you want to stick around and watch today's episode with us? Good. Well, we're going to watch today's episode because it's time for today's adventure. Yo ho ho. Time for the show. Yar. Yar. Yes, Frankenstein. One of, if not the, most famous movie monster. In fact, he's the most famous literary character. Because ever since Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, which was published in 1818, Frankenstein has been a part of pop culture. And back then, the book had a secondary title called The Modern Prometheus. But everybody just kind of forgot about that. This story and this character have been such a huge part of the landscape way before I ever saw the movie. I knew exactly who, or rather what, Frankenstein was. Hell, everyone did. But there's a problem. This ain't Frankenstein. This is. Or this. Or this. Frankenstein is the doctor that created the monster that we all just call Frankenstein. This guy is simply called Frankenstein's monster, or just the monster. Who really knows when we just started referring to him as Frankenstein? And we are all totally incorrect and wrong in doing so, but we do it anyway. Sort of like everything we learned in Dare. Boy, did we let those people down. So anyway, yeah, we call the monster Frankenstein, when really, Frankenstein is the doctor who made him, which in reality is the real monster. He was blinded by ambition and used seriously immoral means to justify the end. This story is the best example of science going too far. Even though what Dr. Frankenstein did isn't possible in the slightest. But grave robbing and reanimating human corpses became a horror movie archetype. And that's one part of what makes this story fascinating. The other being the fact that it's really a tale about a monster who does not want to be a monster. He was forced into it and brought back to life by this dickhead. He didn't want to be feared and hated. He was made to because this asshole got a wild hair up his ass. But regardless of that fact, Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster, has been placed among the great movie monsters of all time. Much like the Wolfman, Frankenstein's monster has no interest or desire to be a monster, where the other classic monsters take great pride in being murderous, scary assholes. So yeah, it's not really a horror story, it's more of a tragedy. And this story was such a hit that long before movies, there were numerous stage productions of this tale. And this story was one of the first ever motion pictures. It was released in 1910 and produced by Thomas Edison. Yeah, that doesn't seem real, but it's true. This story is basically why we have movies today. Motion pictures were a budding technology. Thomas Edison was at the forefront, and Frankenstein made it happen. This film was almost lost forever, but it was restored and eventually released on DVD. Now, this film should be more famous than it is, just given the subtext, but it's not. The most famous Frankenstein on film is, of course, the Universal Pictures version, which was released in theaters November 21st, 1931, and has made Frankenstein even more of a household name ever since. And this movie is pretty scary. Look at that. Man, what a creep. This movie was scary without blood and gore. It's just a genuinely scary film. And next to Dracula, Frankenstein is probably the most famous horror movie of all time. It's had many sequels, many spin-offs, many reimaginations. It's just part of pop culture. Even Alvin and the Chipmunks did a movie about it. Yep, there's a lot of meat on the bone here, and today we're going to examine the world of Frankenstein in today's episode, Finding Frankenstein Movies. Poor Frankenstein, the most misunderstood monster, mainly because nobody ever calls him by his correct name. Think about it from his point of view. Imagine being raised from the dead as a reanimated pile of corpse parts, only to be called somebody else's name. No wonder he was so grumpy. But don't worry, Mr. Frankenstein's monster. You would be treated to multiple releases on VHS, including the first one in 1980 by MCA Home Video. And man, oh man, I know it's pretty minimalist, but I sure do love early VHSs. There's just something about it. I know there's not much going on there, but it just reeks of nostalgia, and I love it. And so do a lot of other people, because this one is very hard to find. And Frankenstein would have another MCA Home Video release in 1986. And this one is a little easier to find, with the price ranging from $20 to $5. And this release also had a Laserdisc counterpart. And in 1991, Universal Pictures decided to re-release all of their classic monster movies on VHS as part of their Universal Monsters Classic Collection. And they went on a huge marketing campaign all about this. Yeah, they teamed up with Doritos and Pepsi and even Miller. So there you go. You got monster movies, Doritos, and beer. So I just don't see how it gets any better. Good. Yep, you're absolutely right. And so Frankenstein was released in 1991 as part of the first series of the Universal Monsters Classic Collection. And by the way, this collection continued to grow all throughout the 90s. And these are very fun to collect today, and some of them are harder to find than others. But you can find Frankenstein very easily and for a very cheap price. And usually, if you search for Frankenstein VHS, this is the one you'll find. And also in 1991, Frankenstein was released alongside Dracula in a 2-tape box set commemorating both of the film's 60th anniversaries. And this box set is relatively easy to find today, with the price averaging around $20. And in 1999, Universal Pictures again released a line of classic monster movie VHS, and Frankenstein was part of it. And the cool part about this line is that all the movies actually featured the original poster art, so that's pretty neat. And some major retailers actually paired up Frankenstein with The Bride of Frankenstein and sold it as a 2-pack. And good luck finding this today. But in all actuality, there really isn't anything too special about this. They really just put both of the 1999 distributions together in cellophane and sold it, so it's not a box set, it's just a value pack. 2 great movies, 1 low price kind of thing. Which brings me to my next point. Frankenstein would enjoy many sequels, including Well, obviously, the first one, The Bride of Frankenstein, which was released in theaters April 20th, 1935. And it picks up right where the first movie left off, and this is regarded as one of the greatest sequels of all time. But of course, this was before Terminator 2. So anyways, yes, The Bride of Frankenstein is a direct sequel to Frankenstein, but you already know that. And in this movie, you would think, after the events in the first movie ended so horribly, that Dr. Frankenstein would learn his lesson. But no, he doesn't. In fact, he goes full throttle and makes another reanimated corpse thing, with the purpose of course, being to make a girlfriend for the monster. And is he successful? Does Frankenstein's monster find true love? Oh, no, not at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Actually, this movie has a pretty horrible ending. I mean, everything goes to shit real quick. And in fact, this has the saddest ending of any movie I've ever seen. Yeah, I know, spoiler alert, whatever. But even if you haven't seen this movie yet, it's still a great watch. There's a lot of other stuff that happens in this movie that's definitely worth seeing. And this is the movie where Frankenstein's monster becomes more and more relatable, and you actually end up rooting for him. Mainly because everybody is such a dick to him. I mean, he tries to be friendly and nice and helpful, but everybody hates him because he's a reanimated pile of corpse parts. And this is also the film where people started calling Frankenstein's monster simply Frankenstein because the title is confusing. The Bride of Frankenstein, and you just assume that this big pile of corpse parts is Frankenstein. And he's getting married, apparently. I did not see that one coming. Well, if you've seen the movie, then you know the title is ambiguous. But people just went with it, assuming that this guy was Frankenstein, but really he's Frankenstein's monster. But we know that now. You know that because I've said it enough goddamn times on this episode. But in the first movie, they did try to distinguish the name game a little bit. They gave the movie the subtext, the man who made a monster, kind of distinguishing Frankenstein from Frankenstein's monster. But with time, everybody just forgot about that. And for years after the film's original release, a lot of marketing and the posters for the sequels always referred to him as Frankenstein's monster or just the monster. So, they tried to get people to call him by the right name, but everybody just kind of said, fuck it.
Oh my God, why don't you just ask him what he wants to be called? What are his preferred pronouns? I'm literally shaking, you shitlord. Oh my God, this isn't happening. Oh my God. Oh, my soy latte.
Thank you. Jeez. Anyways, The Bride of Frankenstein would be released on VHS by MCA Home Video in 1984. And it was also released on Beta. And it was also released on Laserdisc. It's some futuristic shit! Thank you. Anyways, the VHS is a little hard to find nowadays, and it does go for around $20, and the Beta is even harder to find. But it is quite easy to find the Laserdisc, and even the Japanese Laserdisc, for around $15. And of course, if you've been paying attention, it was released again in 1991 as part of the Universal Monsters Classic Collection. And just like Frankenstein, it was part of the first series. And get ready to hear about the Universal Monsters Classic Collection a lot in this episode, because I'm going to bring it up again. And it was released again in 1999 as part of the other Universal Monsters Classic Collection. And both the 1991 and 1999 editions are very easy to find today, mainly because they made so many of them, which also means you can find one for dirt cheap. So we move on down the line of Frankenstein sequels, only to discover that Frankenstein's family tree is getting bigger with the son of Frankenstein. And like The Bride of Frankenstein, this title is ambiguous and a little misleading. It is and it isn't. It's technically about the son of Frankenstein, but it's the son of Dr. Frankenstein. And keep in mind that this was around the same time that everybody just started calling the monster Frankenstein. And you guessed it, his son decides to follow in his father's footsteps and play God. And yes, it ends horribly. But look at that cast. If you're a fan of 1930s spooky movies, then this movie is for you. Well, anyways, it was released in theaters January 13th, 1939, and would be released on VHS by MCA Home Video in 1986, and then again in 1991 as part of, you guessed it, the Universal Monsters Classic Collection. And you can find both of these distributions today for relatively cheap prices. And hell, look at this. There's somebody selling all three of the 1980s MCA home video releases for $12, and two of them are sealed. Wow, that's a pretty damn good price. So let's continue down the happy little trail of Frankenstein sequels with yet another ambiguous title, The Ghost of Frankenstein, which was released in theaters March 13th, 1942, and is, of course, a direct follow-up to The Son of Frankenstein. And this would be the first Frankenstein movie not to feature Boris Karloff as the monster. Instead, it was Lon Chaney Jr. And why didn't Boris Karloff portray the monster in this film? Well, I'd like to say something funny like he didn't fucking want to anymore. I don't fucking want to anymore. But really, he was just busy doing Broadway stuff and was unavailable for the role. And so how was this movie received? Surely by now, people have got to be getting sick of Frankenstein movies, right? Well, kinda, but not really. It had mixed reviews. Some people thought it was delightful and fascinating, while others, like the New York Daily News, described it as horrid, not horrendous, and horribly boring. And that is a fair criticism because I know it's sacrilegious to say this, but a lot of these older monster movies are kind of boring in spots. But that's just how it was. That was the pace of filmmaking back then, and it was good back then, but a lot of this stuff just doesn't hold up nowadays. Especially when you compare them to today's movies with non-stop action, a car chase every 5 seconds, fuck this and fuck that, gratuitous sex and violence everywhere you look. Sex, sex, sex. Sex sells, motherfuckers. That's right. Everything's got to be about sex. And it is a little discouraging to consider our society went that way, considering all the films back then, as bad as they might have been, had a sense of class about them. Compare that to the shit that's produced nowadays. So maybe it's not that these older films are boring, it's just that we have grown insatiable. Well, anyways, The Ghost of Frankenstein wouldn't be released on VHS until 1993 as part of the, you guessed it, the Universal Monsters Classic Collection. And that's it. There's no other VHS distributions of this film. That was the first and last time it was on VHS. Doesn't anybody else find that kind of weird? I think that's kind of weird. Yeah, it's kind of weird. But anyways, yeah, you can find this very easily today and for a pretty cheap price. So let's mosey on down the line of Frankenstein movies to our next film, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. And this movie could be called the first ever crossover film and the first time that a film universe was established. A trend nowadays that was made famous by the Marvel movies, but back then, there wasn't such a thing. This was the first one. And what a picture. I mean, just that title alone makes you want to go to the theater to see it. Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman? Holy shit, what am I about to see? Well, this movie wasn't exactly loved by critics, but moviegoers certainly loved it. And it certainly gave people a new perspective on movies. I mean, just the fact that movies can cross over now, definitely broaden the horizons. And this is a concept we would see again in 2003 with Freddy vs. Jason. Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman was released in theaters March 5th, 1943. And this movie is a follow-up to The Ghost of Frankenstein, making it the 5th installment to the Frankenstein movies, and is also a direct sequel to The Wolfman, making this sort of like Rudolph and Frosty's Christmas in July, which could possibly be the dumbest thing I've ever said. And this movie would see Lon Chaney Jr. reprise his role as the Wolfman. Hey, wait a minute. Didn't Lon Chaney Jr. just play Frankenstein's monster in The Ghost of Frankenstein? Okay, so who's playing Frankenstein's monster? Bela Lugosi? Wait, wasn't he Igor in The Son of Frankenstein and The Ghost of Frankenstein? And wasn't he Dracula? This is getting interesting. And I wonder why they went with Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman instead of Frankenstein versus the Wolfman. Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman for coffee. Well, anyway, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman for coffee was... Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman was released on VHS by MCA Home Video in 1986. And again in 1990, with the only difference being the MCA logo. 1986, 1990. 86, 90. See? And again in 1992 as part of the second wave of, you guessed it, the Universal Monsters Classic Collection. So let's continue down the line of Frankenstein sequels with The House of Frankenstein. And this is where it sort of gets batshit crazy. It was released in theaters February 16th, 1945, and boasts an all-star cast of monster mayhem.
Monster Mayhem.
Yeah, it's got Dracula and Frankenstein's monster and the Wolfman, though really the only actor reprising their role is Lon Chaney Jr. as the Wolfman. You got Glenn Strange portraying Frankenstein's monster, and you got John Carradine portraying Dracula. Yes, John Carradine, as in Dave and Keith Carradine's father. And what's funny about this is Boris Karloff is actually in this movie, yet he doesn't play Frankenstein's monster. It's kind of weird.
I don't fucking want to do this anymore.
And this would only have one VHS release in 1992, and I bet you can't guess what collection it's from. Yep, the Universal fucking Monsters Classic fucking Collection. We continue on our little journey down Frankenstein movies and come to The House of Dracula, which was released in theaters December 7th, 1945, and is sort of the same kind of movie The House of Frankenstein was, where it's a bunch of famous monsters crammed into a plot line. It's actually sort of like the Traveling Wilburys of monsters, though, as the title implies, this movie has more to do with Dracula than it does Frankenstein's monster. But Frankenstein's monster is in it, of course. I wouldn't be talking about it if he fucking wasn't. And much like The House of Frankenstein, this would only have one VHS, and take a wild fucking guess as to what collection it's in. The Universal Monsters Classics Collection. But this would also have a Laserdisc that was paired up with The House of Frankenstein. In fact, pretty much all the Frankenstein movies have a Laserdisc. So, you know. And so Universal Pictures wasn't quite done with the Frankenstein concept and decided to break into the realm of horror comedy and paired up the world's most iconic monsters with one of the world's most iconic comedic duos with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which was released in theaters June 15th, 1948. And this was a smash hit. In fact, it's number 56 on the American Film Institute's list of top 100 funniest movies of all time. And in 2001, the Library of Congress deemed this movie historically and culturally significant and selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry. Now, the jury is still out as to whether or not this actually fits in the chronological order of the Frankenstein movies, and if in fact it's an actual Frankenstein movie. But, you know, for argument's sake, we'll say it is. Because, I mean, technically, this is the 8th Frankenstein film. And much like House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, this is an all-star monster movie. There's Glenn Strange playing Frankenstein's monster, Bela Lugosi reprises his role as Count Dracula, and Lon Chaney Jr. once again plays the Wolfman. And not only is this technically a Frankenstein movie, but it's also a Dracula movie and a Wolfman movie, so that's pretty loaded. And by the end of the movie, this turns into an all-out monster brawl that Abbott and Costello just happened to be a part of. It's pretty great. And this would go on to be released on VHS by MCA Home Video in 1988, as well as on Beta. And it was released again in 1992, and no, it's not part of the Universal Monsters Classic Collection, even though it really should be. Oh well. And it would be released one more time in 1999. And all of these distributions are pretty easy to find and they're very cheap, so I recommend picking this movie up for your collection today. So the last 4 of the Universal Pictures Frankenstein movies were a collaboration of all the most iconic monsters. And we really didn't see this concept on film again until 1987 with the release of Monster Squad. And don't worry, I'll be talking about this gem soon enough. Oh, and by the way, there does exist an Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein board game, so that would be pretty cool to have. And so the Universal Pictures monster movies would be the most famous and recognizable. However, there was another studio that wanted to get into the monster movie game, and that studio was Hammer Films. And Hammer Films would have their own versions of these famous monster movies. And to be honest with you, Hammer Films really deserves its own episode, and I will be covering them in the future. So I'm not going to be getting into too many details here. But I will say, though they were more famous for their Dracula renditions, they did do a series of Frankenstein films, and they're also known to be more ghoulish and ghastly than the Universal Pictures counterparts. And another big difference between the Universal Pictures Frankenstein and the Hammer Films Frankenstein is Dr. Frankenstein himself. You see, in the Universal Pictures Frankenstein, he is referred to as Dr. Henry Frankenstein. But in the Hammer Films versions, he is referred to as Dr. Victor Frankenstein, which is the actual name from the book. So why did Universal Pictures change his name? Apparently, studio executives felt the name Victor was too harsh and scary for American audiences, so they changed it to Henry. Henry. Does that make sense to anyone else? I mean, you're talking about a story that's about a guy who digs up graves to make a reanimated corpse monster, and you're worried that his name is too scary. Huh. But Hammer Films did not give two shits about that, and, like Universal Pictures, they had a slew of Frankenstein movies. 7 to be exact. There's The Curse of Frankenstein from 1957, The Revenge of Frankenstein from 1958, The Evil of Frankenstein from 1964, The Pleasant Little Herb Garden of Frankenstein from 1965. No, I'm just kidding about that. But there was Frankenstein Created Woman from 1967, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed from 1969, The Horror of Frankenstein from 1970, and Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell from 1974. Pretty dramatic titles, huh? The Curse of Frankenstein would be released on VHS in 1986 by Warner Brothers Home Video. And it comes in the Warner Brothers Home Video early 80s clamshell that they're so famous for. And it would be released again in 1993. I mean, this is cool and all, but what's up with the cover art? They couldn't have picked a better picture? I mean, it looks like he's discussing economics at a bar. Frankenstein and the really lame VHS cover. And the other Hammer Frankenstein films would eventually be released on VHS, but it sure took them long enough. They wouldn't have VHS until the 1990s. All throughout the 90s, in fact, with different distributors for each film. Sure, they had MCA Home Video, Paramount Home Video, Anchor Bay, Columbia TriStar, Warner Brothers. I mean, you name it, they had them. Unlike the Universal Pictures monster movies, the Hammer films did not have a compiled collection on VHS, such as the Universal Monsters Classics Collection. But Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed was part of the Warner Brothers Hits collection in 1998. And though pretty much all of the Hammer Frankenstein movies were released on VHS through the 90s, The Evil of Frankenstein was released on Beta in 1987, and this goes for a pretty high price. And apparently the cover art was drawn by an 8th grader. So what is the value of these VHS nowadays? Surely they've got to be sought after and pretty hard to find, right? Well, you'd be surprised. They're actually pretty easy to find and go for around $10. There are some that go for around $40, and then there's people like this. Yeah. And people like this. Yeah. Now, to be fair, they are selling this as a lot paired up with a few other older horror movies, but still, even to the most stalwart VHS collector, $1,000 is pretty damn high, and no one is going to pay that. So, Universal Pictures and Hammer Films are two of the most famous studios that have done Frankenstein renditions, and usually, if you think of Frankenstein movies, you think of these two studios. But there were plenty of others who got into the Frankenstein game, and for better or for worse, there are lots of Frankenstein concepts out there. Some of them are more absurd than others. For example, did you know that in Japan, Frankenstein's monster is a giant fucking monster? And we would discover this in 1965 with the release of Frankenstein Conquers the World, but it was also released under the title Frankenstein vs. Baragon. And Baragon is also featured in a variety of Godzilla films, which means that Frankenstein's monster is part of the Godzilla universe. So, wow. Now, this was never released on VHS in the US, but it was released multiple times on VHS in Japan. and it goes for a pretty penny nowadays. And this was also released on Laserdisc, but only in Japan. And then there's I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, which was released in 1957 and eventually released on VHS in 1991 by RCA Columbia Home Video. And then there was a made-for-TV movie in 1973 called Frankenstein, The True Story. And this was eventually released on VHS by Good Times Home Video, and it seems like a lot of people have forgotten about this movie, but there's actually a pretty good reason for that. You know, it's not all that good. And then there was another made-for-TV movie in 1984 that starred Carrie Fisher. And this was released on VHS by Video Treasures. And this is another forgotten-about Frankenstein movie. And again, for the same reason that it's not all that good. And then there was another made-for-TV movie in 1992. Gosh, Frankenstein certainly had a lot of TV movies. And this one starred Randy Quaid portraying Frankenstein's monster. And that's a pretty odd casting. And speaking of odd castings, we have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was released in theaters November 4th, 1994, and of course features Robert De Niro portraying Frankenstein's monster. Which, I mean, come on. That has to be one of the strangest casting decisions ever made. Well, anyways, since this movie was a big Hollywood blockbuster, it was released on VHS by the millions. So, that means that today, this tape isn't worth shit. And then we have Frankenstein Unbound, which was released in theaters November 2nd, 1990. And this stars Raul Julia and John Hurt. So the cast is pretty solid, but the movie is kind of weird. I mean, look at this. This is Frankenstein's monster, and it looks like a villain from Green Lantern. And the lead singer of NXS is in this. Okay, but it does have some pretty neat poster art. I mean, look at that. All the eyeballs are sewn together. It's so gnarly. And it did have an odd tagline. The monster movie for the thinking person. Okay, calm down there. And this would go on to be released on VHS in 1991, and it's pretty simple to find today, and it goes for around $10. And then we have Blackenstein, which was released in theaters August 3rd, 1973. And this movie is so bad, but it's one of those movies that it's so bad it's good. And it was released on VHS by Media Home Entertainment in 1980 and in 1984, and it wouldn't be released again on VHS until 1997. And today, these are pretty pricey. All except the 97 version, which goes for around $10. And then we have a Frankenstein movie produced by probably one of the most overrated people of all time in Andy Warhol's Frankenstein. This was released in 1973, and overseas it had the title Flesh for Frankenstein. And this was eventually released on VHS, and you could find this one today for around $5, just in case you wanted to make your VHS collection more pretentious. And then we have the Italian film Frankenstein's Castle of Freaks from 1974. And when this was released in the States, it was released under a variety of names. It was Terror Castle, The House of Freaks, The Monsters of Dr. Frankenstein, and Frankenstein's Castle. But this film gained the most notoriety when it was featured on Elvira's Movie Macabre. And this was released on VHS by Magnum Home Video, and it fetches a pretty steep price nowadays. And this was also released as one of those double feature tapes. 2 movies, 1 tape kind of deal. It was paired up with The Mad Butcher. I wonder what he's so mad about. Anyway, it goes for around 40 buckaroonies. And it was released again in the 1990s by Something Weird Video. And this one is pretty hard to find, and the ones you do find go for an outrageous price. Yeah, pal, I don't think you're going to get that much.
And going back to made-for-TV movies about Frankenstein, there was yet another television movie made in 1973. The one I mentioned earlier was made in Britain, and this one was made in the United States.
And this was released on VHS as part of the Thriller home video collection that features Elvira. Another Elvira mention. Not that I mind talking about her. She's pretty.
Good.
Yeah, you ain't kidding. And this too goes for $40 today, and if you're a collector of the Thriller home video series, you know that this stuff is pretty pricey. And then there's Frankenstein's Daughter from 1958, and then the follow-up from 1966 with Jesse James meets Frankenstein's Daughter. Yeah, it's just as ridiculous as it sounds. And this was released on VHS multiple times, including one from Embassy Home Video, one from MGM's Midnight Movie Collection, and another one hosted by Elvira from her Midnight Madness Collection. I really didn't think I'd be talking about Elvira so much in this episode. And then there's Frankenstein, 1970. That was released in 1958. And Boris Karloff is in this, and in this one he plays Victor Frankenstein. Surely he can't be as scary as when he played the monster. Oh my god! And this was released on VHS in 1997 and goes for around $5 today. And then we have Dracula vs. Frankenstein. Now this is more like it. This is the movie we've all wanted to see, but it's the epitome of a B movie. And Lon Chaney Jr. is in this. And this was released on VHS multiple times, and it's sort of easy to find. And there's Lady Frankenstein from 1971. And this has a few VHS distributions, and each one is sort of easy to find.
And then, of course, there's Young Frankenstein, which was released in theaters December 5th, 1974, and is regarded as many people's favorite Frankenstein rendition. This classic was released on VHS multiple times, the most famous being the 20th Century Fox Selection Collection.
There is a ton of material out there all about Frankenstein, because Frankenstein is very important to our society. It's a staple of pop culture, and Mary Shelley really hit the nail on the head when she wrote this. And all the adaptations have a moral lesson to them that playing God is bad. And even in movies like Jurassic Park, it's a lesson that's learned the hard way. Sure, you might be successful in your experiment, but trust me, it's going to end horribly. And speaking of ending horribly, that brings us to the end of today's adventure. So thank you for checking out the show, and be sure to hit subscribe so you can tune in to every adventure only on Captain Adam's VHS pirate ship. Happy Halloween, mateys!